We're going to, I think, hear a very different kind of presentation now from Paulo Tavares, who's setting up here. He's an architect and urbanist who's been based in Quito and Sao Paulo and teaches design and spatial theory at the School of Architecture, Design and Arts in Quito, and has long been affiliated with Goldsmith's Center for Research Architecture, and in particular its Forensis initiative. And his work has been shown in numerous research art exhibitions, including Insert in 2014 in New Delhi, Animism in Beirut in 2013, and the Taipei Biennial in 2012. In this term, he is working at Princeton University as part of the Conflict Shorelines Research Studio that's been set up at Princeton this term, along with A.L. Weitzman and Eduardo Cadava of Princeton, A.L. coming from Goldsmiths, which is a really, I think, an amazing project. And you can find some information online about this. And their topic at this Conflict Shorelines Research Studio is Amazonia, a botanical archaeology of genocide. So welcome, Paulo.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to spend some moments with you and very happy to share this table with Leila. So as TJ was mentioning, I am an architect, but not the kind of traditional architect who built things. We in this group, this agency called Forensic Architecture, set up by A.L. Weissman, we are more interested in reading ruins. In reading patterns of destruction, patterns of violence. Basically what we do in this agency, we provide evidence for civil organizations, truth commissions, NGOs, like for example Amazon Watch, or other types of civilian organizations to hold governments and accountable, to hold corporations or those who hold power accountable for their right violations against the rights of people and why not the rights of nature. This is one of the cases that we work on. We work lots with remote sense technology, maps, visual narratives. This was in the case of the genocide of the Ixil people, the trial in Guatemala, the trial of the dictator Rios Montt, which will also provide evidence for communities that were suing Rios Montt, who hopefully will go back to trial at the beginning of 2016. So that's what we do. We provide evidence, we design evidence. We work in the interface between rights violations and human rights. And what I'm going to show to you today is a case that is connected to the Brazilian Truth Commission that was set up in 2012. As TJ mentioned, this case is usually taught botanical archaeology of genocide. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit of the context of this case before I arrive to it. So I have to draw a little bit on the history of the military dictatorship in Brazil to show to you what is the context of this case. So everything sort of starts with the capital, Brasilia. The urbanist Lúcio Costa, when he was designing the capital, Brasilia, he wrote, "It was born out of the primary gesture of one who marks and takes possession of a place. Two X crossing at the right angle, the very sign of the cross." So modernization in Latin America was really a project of colonization, was really a project of conquering indigenous territory. As you know, Brasilia is on the center of the Brazilian territory, and it was really, as the urbanist was saying, the very modern gesture of Brasilia was, in fact, a colonial project. But what is most remarkable about this colonial project, it was not only the conquest of the territory, it was really the conquest of what we say nature itself. Brasilia implied a radical process of terraforming, of redesigning nature, of redesigning the environment. It implied modifying the climate of central Brazil, that the white settler society could live in this region. It was really a process of what I would call geodesign. Now, when the Brazilian military dictatorships take power, these projects of advancement of the frontiers, of the modern colonial frontiers towards the Brazilian territory is going to grow increasingly militarized. The conquest of the interior is going to become very much aligned with the doctrines of security, doctrines of national security that were enforced in Latin America during the so-called Dirty Wars. And one of the first acts of this new process of geodesign implemented by the military was to draw what they call the legal Amazonia. Legal Amazonia is a jurisdiction, as you see in red, which nearly overlap with the boundaries of the natural Amazonia, of the biogeographic Amazonia. And what this jurisdiction allowed to do was that the military could design projects nearly on the same scale of the Amazon basin. Sometimes these projects would take the form of creating a lake inside the basin, for example, create what they would call a Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes they would take the form of completely redrawing the very spatial logics of the Amazonian watershed. And I'm going to show some snapshots, some images of this project. So again, the idea that modernization was fundamentally a colonial project. We usually tend to think that deforestation in Amazonia is a chaotic project, but in fact it was conducted by design, as you can see in this image. So Operation Amazonia, as they call it, really led to widespread, long-term, dramatic environmental transformation and destruction in Amazonia. Now, what's interesting to frame in relation to climate change is that this period, the period of the military dictatorship in Brazil, or the so-called dirty wars of the global Cold War, it's also a period that geologists or climate science are going to call the Great Acceleration, the most rapid transformation of the human relationship with the natural world in the history of humankind. That means that every little single index of the humanity's footprint on the globe has accelerated dramatically during these years, right? And this period is really considered one of the most, let's say, radical process in the historical process of producing climate change. This is one of the most fundamental, let's say, geological events in which the Earth system is going to change at incredibly speed and intensity and in its most dramatically form. So let's say that climate change was somehow generated during this period to a large extent. But we also tend to see the kind of traditional interpretation of climate change and of this index is that climate change and global warming, they would be a sort of collateral project or collateral damage or a collateral effect of growth, right, as represented by these graphics, of economic development, of technological development, of human progress. That is to say, it's almost considered as a sort of an intentional consequence of a process of development achieved by humankind, in which this period specifically is considered, let's say, a kind of very particular episode. But of course that we know that this moment of the Great Acceleration was also a moment of extreme violence, specifically the frontiers of the Third World, when they were controlled by military dictatorships, which vowed to colonize the hinterlands of the countries. So there is a kind of very intimate connection between this process of colonization, transformation of the environment, and the terror by which the military dictatorships of Latin America were governing their own countries and the colonial project that they implemented on the ground. So my point here is to say that climate change has to be analyzed and has to be framed as a historical conflict which involves colonial violence, right? It's not the project, a kind of collateral, unintended effect of economic growth, of development, of human progress, but in fact it has to be situated in colonial power and the ways in which colonial violence is perpetrated on the ground. Of course, that the military, when they were doing their interventions, the process of geodesign, they were not intervening in empty territory. Unfortunately, the slide is a bit washed here, so we cannot see, but this is an ethnographic, ethnohistorical map of Brazil, and it's colored with different and multi-layered color codes, which show that, in fact, Brazil was a plurinational territory inhabited by different hundreds of different indigenous nations. And the project of the military was precisely to deplurinationalize this territory, to turn into a sort of homogeneous social space in the image of Brazilian national society. And in order to do so and to conquer the indigenous land, they implement a process which was called, in official policy, a process of pacification. So basically, they were contacting those indigenous groups and resettling them in what they would call indigenous posts. And in these indigenous posts, they would implement certain policies to, quote unquote, civilize them, to bring them to the national society, to teach them the habits of nationalism and the habits of white civilization. So this project, although it was projected as a sort of project of modernization of the interior and of the population, it was, of course, a project based on a colonial rationale, and in fact it derived its main governmental strategies from tactics which were formulated during colonialism, as for example the strategy of aldeamento of Indios, which as this image represents in the 18th century, and then the aldeamento of the state agency that was conducted in Brazil, which was called the Service for the Protection of the Indians. That's why you see SPI there. So what is an aldeamento? Aldeamento is a place where they would draw the indigenous people and concentrate them in order for you to clear, make space to occupy their lands. And this has been used in the colonial period, and in the military and the Brazilian national modern state actualized this as a process of modernization. So by the end of the, mid-60s or by the 50s, by the mid-60s, when Brazil was under military dictatorship, there were more than 100 indigenous posts distributed throughout the continental hinterlands of Brazil territory. So what they were doing is, distributing those posts, trying to attract the indigenous population and somehow transforming their own modes of life, trying, in fact, to, we could say, destroy their modes of life in order to produce national citizens. This is what I call the politics of erasure. And I'm going now, I need to give you this background so we can situate ourselves. So on the one hand, we have this process of geodesign, which is somehow connected to climate change. On the other hand, we have this process of pacification, which came in support of this geodesign, and this violence is somehow also connected to, or what I would say, one of the most important anthropogenic drivers of climate change. Now I arrive to the case which is, the case that we engaged with to provide evidence in relation to the Brazilian Truth Commission, which is the case of the Waimiri Troari Caribe group, which lives just north of Manaus, which is a city, the capital of the state of Amazonas in Brazil, situated in the Amazon River. And this is the process, the project of pacification that the military designed for the Waimiri Troari, because their land is rich in mineral resources and it's connected. And since it's very near by Manaus, it's also located in a strategic position. So they wanted to build a large-scale hydroelectric dam in this area, as well as extract the mineral resources. So this is the process, the project of pacification that they designed. And what you can see in this map here is what they call an aldeamento. And here are the villages that they identified in one of the aerial surveys as photographed here. So the strategy was to transfer all this population here to this aldeamento, to conduct a process of forcibly transfer in order to open a highway here and a dam here. And that's precisely what they did. This map sort of maps the process of pacification that really happens based on a series of testimonies and other types of evidence. So here is the Waimeria-Tuari territory in 1970, if I'm not wrong, and here is another image of the Waimeria-Tuari territory as it was in the mid-80s or the late 80s after the process of pacification. As you can see, there is a large hydroelectric dam here. There is a big road cutting through their land, and here projects of agricultural colonization implemented by the government, here as well. And in those arrows here, you see the process of forcibly resettlement of this population. So they were taken then out of from the margins of the rivers and concentrated then in key different points, so they could really open the land, they could really depopulate this area in order to exploit it. Now, we know that at least, according to the Truth Commission, at least 90% of the population was killed during this process of pacification. And we want to investigate this case. But the problem in the case of the Waimiri, as well as the problem in the case of most of the indigenous population that were targeted by this genocidal politics, is that we don't have the means of providing evidence as in the traditional mode that usually truth commissions engage with evidentiary material. That means we don't know, in fact, how many people were there, because precisely we don't have statistics, we don't have demographic surveys, we don't have the apparatus, the state apparatus, which is used to control and to govern its citizens, precisely because the state was not there. This was not state land. The state wanted to enter there, in fact, to factor citizens. So there is a problem there. There's a problem here, which is precisely the lack of evidence, right? The lack of evidence to measure, to account for the nature of the destruction, for the scale of destruction. How many people can we say that in fact disappeared during this period? How many were the political disappeared of the indigenous population? This lack of evidence usually made the indigenous population not be part as the traditional iconography of the missing persons of Latin America. They are generally what I would say the disappeared of the disappeared. They disappeared even from the historical records because since we cannot operate with the same type of evidence that is used to describe those crimes, which as you see in this image, usually they is portrayed by this kind of photograph of one person, which really denotes not only the physical body, but also the legal body of the person, because they are very similar to these photos used by ID cards, police files, medical files, which are documents of the state. But we don't have this kind of document. We don't have this kind of evidence. So that was one of our problems. The only evidence that we have that this village, that the Armenia was subjected to violence, was the image of the destruction of this village, which was taken by one of the operators of the process of pacification. So we needed to develop a technique to find evidence, to harvest evidence, to map the scale and the nature of the destruction. So what we did is we employed a technique used to map the carbon cycle, to map climate change, global climate change. This technique allows you to say what is the age of the forest. So when you look to a forest, usually specifically from a satellite image, it would appear to you as an homogeneous mass of green, but there are variations in the age of the forest. And it's important to identify the variations in the age of the forest because forests with different ages, they harbor different biomass, and harboring different biomass, they hold different amounts of carbon. So if you want to map climate change, the carbon cycle, you need to know what is the age of the forest. So we took this technique, which is generally used to map global climate change, and we apply in the region of the Waimeria-Troari. So here is an area of the territory which was subjected to the agricultural programs of colonization of the Waimeria, just south of, of their territory. So when we run this filter, when we run this code in this image, what you can see is that some areas, as for example, this area here, which appears as a sort of old growth, ancient forest, is in fact a very young forest, which just have, if I'm not wrong, 12 years old. You can also see other patches, for example here. It would appear a different forest. So we applied to the region where the Waimiri live today. And then it gives us some very interesting information. For example, you could see that the village is not just the little spots, but in fact, it stands much longer. You could see that, patches of young forest would appear around the village, but also in other areas, they would start to see like these bubble-shaped patches of very young forest in the landscape, which at first sight would look like natural forests, but in fact they were forests that bear some trace of human influence. Now, when we applied in areas where there were testimonies, some sort of evidence that villages have been destroyed, we start to see that these bubble shapes would appear in very interesting geographical patterns, as you can see. Here is the dam, right, where certain indigenous people were living, and we can see that these bubble shapes start to Here's a signature of an ancient village on the left side and a new one on the right side. The nomadic architecture of the village, with multiple rings of Sweden's gardens and follows, the historical movement of occupation and abandonment, because these people would live in one village, abandon, and continue to visit the same village, left a traceable footprint in the landscape, whose archaeological record can be identified in the botanical structure of the forest. What we have to imagine is that these interventions, when you run, they can look like very tiny little interventions, but when we run the code through a very extensive area, what you would see, in fact, the image is really washed, but you would see that these bubble spots, they occupy a much vaster territory, making the Waimeria-Troari territory a very populated, a very, let's say, dynamic social environment. Their geography, the geographic distribution, the secondary forest formations that you see there, which began to grow in the 70s, when the violence was most intense in the Kenyan territory, in the Waimeria-Troari territory. They indicate the location of villages that were destroyed or where inhabitants were evicted. Their geography demonstrates that the Brazilian military dictatorship was not intervening upon an empty territory, and reveals the existence of a planned strategy aimed at disrupting, transforming, and annihilating modes of inhabiting the forest that were considered inimical to the project of national development. Moreover, the cartography of the missing villages also project an image of Amazonia that radically opposes the colonial ideology fostered by the military regime, according to which the forest was a depopulated, backward, and primitive territory. This ideological edifice was inherited from evolutionary descriptions that portray Amazonia as a pristine natural environment inhabited by collectives that were incapable of transforming their surroundings. But instead of lack of traces of anthropogenic action in the landscape, the botanical archaeology of genocide shows signatures of a highly manipulated environments. So apart from the question that that is very difficult to see in the map that these landscapes were modified by humans, one of the main reasons for the difficulty in distinguishing the secondary forests, what we'll call secondary human-made forests, or cultural forests of Amazonia, that is to say forests made by culture, is that they are also remarkably similar to high forests or natural forests in terms of species diversity. There is the botanical composition, the biodiversity of forests made by indigenous mode of inhabitation is very similar to what we would understand as a natural forests. I'm going to play a video for you very quickly.
So when they left, these weren't even farmers, they were just transitory people on the landscape. Even transitory people on the landscape can make a difference to the forest. I've been looking at that more on a qualitative, not quantitative basis. You know, I've been seeing what ways this is happening. Abandoned home sites, abandoned fields. In Brazil they call them roças, in Brazil they call them chacras. In other parts of Latin America they call them conucos or fincas. These are abandoned fields. And the forest, when it comes back, it's not the same forest because they've been planting trees in their fields. After the annual crops finish, it's a turnover into two perennial crops, fruit trees primarily. Plus birds and animals drop seeds in the open spaces that people have created. So what happens when the forest comes back, it's actually kind of an orchard, kind of a man-made orchard. And for the untrained eye, it's not obvious. But the more I've been working in the Amazon for 43 years, and it took me a while for me to realize that this forest was not a virgin forest. I always had this romantic idea that humans were, you know, destroyers of the forest, that they were reducing biodiversity. And so over time I began to realize the forests that I've been walking through I think again, we're foreign.
I cut short because I want to leave some space for discussion, but this is ethnobotanist. I've been working lots with ethnobotanists, although I'm an architect. Because what's fascinating about ethnobotanists is that they can read the forest as architecture. Now, our impression, our idea that Amazonia was a pristine, natural, completely natural environment was what has driven the process of colonization. This colonial imaginary was what has driven this process of domestication of the forest. Now, one of the most important, let's say, arguments in that colonial perspective was precisely the idea that in Amazonia you didn't have urban complex. You didn't have urban societies. But the problem is that this was a colonial gaze, that the forest itself has to be interpreted as an architecture. And here you see how Nigel Smith really can read certain types of structures, the density of the canopy, the geometry of the canopy, the way that the canopy is organized as an evidence of cultural forest in Amazonia. We need to interpret the very structure of the forest through the syntax of architecture and urbanism in a large extent, in order to understand that this is in fact a constructed environment. Right, and here I'll join with Leila in saying that's why indigenous people are fighting against climate change, because their types of political cultural arrangement are producing different natures than the type of nature that colonial capitalism has produced, right? And therefore they're also combating climate change. What's most remarkable, for example, palm trees are also indexes of anthropogenic intervention in the landscape. Archaeologists have been found large-scale infrastructures throughout Amazonia, showing that the past of one of the most important biodiversity refuges on Earth is as much rich in nature as it is in culture. Soil of Amazonia usually is also another important evidence to say that this is in fact a human-made environment. That is to say, the soil of the forest is also the material with which this architecture was built. And we need to really see the forest as a ruin to a large extent, but as a living ruin. Here it's areas deforested. I'm not entirely sure now what it is. I don't remember. I think it's Pano River. This photograph is by archaeologists. Michel Hackenberger. So you see when they deforested the area, you see that the whole landscape was in fact human-made. Okay, we know that Amazonia operates as a geophysical engine in the Earth system. Here's a map of biodiversity. You see that Amazonia is the most biodiverse region on Earth. Here's an image of forest canopy height. And what's interesting about this map, you see that Amazonia not only holds the largest mass of tropical forests in the world, but this is a map that sees the forest not only as trees, but as carbon stocks, right? So people have to measure the height of the canopy to understand that the forest, how much carbon the forest holds. So as you see, Amazonia is also a huge pool of carbon stock, right? Regulating the transfer of energy of the entire planet system. This is the green ocean. As Leila was explaining, Amazonia is often treated as a green ocean because it generates huge amounts of water and drives the entire cycle of Latin America and beyond. Okay, now I'm getting close to my last comments, which would be the climate force of political violence, meaning that colonial violence is one of the main anthropogenic drivers of climate change. In yellow, you see the area which is called the Arc of Fire. This is one of the most noxious ruins that the project of geodesign carried out by the military dictatorship produced. Fire is something that operates on an industrial scale in Amazonia now. And it's really driving a process of what some climate science would call the savanization of Amazonia. So these are the ruins, the environmental ruins of colonial modernity to a large extent. And here in Amazonia, there are some, let's say, when you talk about ruins, there are some paradoxes, right? First of all, it was a region that was initially perceived that there was no ruins there, no archaeological complex there. So far, it was completely natural, right? Or the kind of ruin that we see, or either we see it without ruins, right? Meaning without architecture, without culture, without urbanism, right? Without peoples capable of intervening in this environment. Or we see this kind of ruin, which is in fact the ruins of modern colonialism, right? But as I try to convey to you, I try to show the forest as also a very different type of ruin, right? As a kind of living ruin, which is in fact the forest itself. And climate change is, to a large extent, the word of climate change is a word of ruins. And we need to learn to live amid these ruins. We need to learn to live amid these ruins. Now it's a question of what kind of ruin are we going to learn, are we going to prefer to believe with? The ruins of this type of very sophisticated, very complex urban organizations, modes of organizing populations and territories that we see inscribed in the very memory of the forest, or if you want to prefer the ruins caused by the expansion of monocultures of capitalism. This Amazonia has been going to severe droughts in recent years, but I'm going to jump this. And this is just to conclude. As I said, violence, colonial violence, is one of the main drivers of climate change we could see. But we also have to locate kind of decolonial resistance to this model as something that interferes on the level of the Earth system. So again, I would corroborate Leila's lecture saying that enforcing indigenous people rights is a way of interfering in climate change, right? It's not just protecting their territories, it's really a way of operating the Earth system. And just this map, to conclude, this is a kind of contemporary map of Amazonia. So as you see on the right-hand side, practically the entire western Amazonia has been blocked for oil drilling. These are in yellow, you see oil blocks. In the black dots, you see dams. There are more than 400 dams planned to be built in Amazonia in the near future, causing most probably a kind of radical change in its hydrological cycle, in as much as free-floating rivers are going to turn into networks of dams. Somehow the project of the military dictatorship is being actualized just right now, right? In purple, you see the Arc of Fire, which is the region where climate change is being most severely felt. And in what's important about this map, in the red crosses, you see cases of target assassinations, extrajudicial executions of land right defenders and nature right defenders. So in Amazonia, deforestation, ecological depletion, ecological destruction comes together with a pattern, overlaps a pattern of political violence. And this is the question that we do need to address when we are talking about nature, when we are talking about the environment. We need to understand that it's a process that is embedded, immersed within certain larger political conflicts, or even localized political conflicts, which imply much larger questions in relation to the people, and again referring to Leila's great presentation, that are at the front lines of combating climate change. In as much as violence must be seen as also one of the main drivers of the environmental transformations that are affecting the whole space of the Earth. So again, to conclude, if we can make this claim that colonialism is also one of main anthropogenic drivers of what has happened to this planet, we also need to account and to search for modes of decolonial resistance which are also operating on the space of the Earth. Thank you very much.